Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Van Sollebehere. I'm the Frank G. Thompson Professor of Government in Harvard College. And this afternoon's session is on reforming energy infrastructure, which, as we heard from the earlier presentations today, is a critical obstacle to moving forward with decarbonization. We have a really great panel. I selected this panel with a bunch of different dimensions in mind. First of all, it's addressing what I consider to be one of the interesting opportunities here in Cambridge, which is bridging MIT and Harvard and the tremendous resources at both institutions. It's also cross school, so we have representation from the law school, the Kennedy School, a management school, not HBS, but Sloan, and economics department, so social sciences. And we're really trying to engage across a lot of disciplines in dealing with this problem because it spans a lot of different problems and a lot of different fields of inquiry and expertise. We're joined today by Paul Joskow, who is the Elizabeth and James Killian Professor of Economics and President Emeritus of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. His expertise includes industrial organization and energy and environmental economics. He's a member of the American Academy of Sciences and Council of Foreign Relations. He's currently on the board of Exelon and on the board of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research. Paul is the person who first drew me into this field 20 years ago, working with an astonishing team of colleagues at MIT, and I'm forever grateful for that. We're also joined by Bill Hogan, who is the Raymond Planck Research Professor of Global Energy Policy and the Research Director of the Harvard Electricity Policy Research Group, which is a very important group on campus for modeling and understanding the electricity system in the United States. He's also past president of the International Association for Energy Economics. And Chris Knittel joins us from the Sloan School. He is the George P. Schultz Professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research focuses on industrial organization, environmental economics, and applied econometrics. He's the director of MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, which is an important think tank here in Cambridge addressing different problems in this space. And finally, Ari Pesco is the director of Energy Law Initiative at Harvard Law School. He is an energy lawyer with focus on the electricity industry and environmental regulations. Prior to coming to Harvard, he was an associate at a law firm in DC where he litigated before FERC about the Western energy crisis, among many other things. So happy to have you all here. The way we're going to run today's session is we're going to just give a setting of the stage by going across the group and asking them their thoughts on specific pieces of the big problem. And then we'll open things up for conversation and questions among the group, because there's a lot of expertise here in the audience as well. And I'd like to start with Paul, just to set the stage a bit, which is to ask you, broadly, what should be our goals in the United States to achieve decarbonization through infrastructure? What are realistic objectives, and what are maybe some more ambitious objectives and goals that the U.S. should have?
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. I aged out of the Exelon board a week ago, so I have no conflicts here. I don't know if that's good or bad, but after 15 years. So I think the goals are pretty straightforward. It's the implementation of the goals that's challenging. I mean, we want to meet greenhouse gas constraints or targets or goals, whatever you want to call them, efficiently. That is in a least cost manner, given the technological opportunities we have for zero and low emissions generation, storage, and other zero or near zero dispatchable generating capacity. We want to do it in a way that meets system reliability criteria, taking account of the intermittency of output from wind and solar generators, storage opportunities, residual dispatchable generation, suitable for balancing intermittency, and support increased supplies of electricity to meet the goals of other sectors, in particular electrification of the transportation sector, electrification of buildings and segments of other sectors, which is likely to increase the demand for electricity over the next 25 or 30 years by something like 50 to 100%. I think you want to do it in a way that recognizes the impacts on various stakeholder groups affected by the changing configuration of the grid and the development of new facilities. This is both I would say, a normative and a positive goal. It's the right thing to do to take account of impacts on various groups, but also if you're going to get major new facilities approved, whether they're generation facilities or transmission facilities, you have to deal with the affected groups and make sure that they will go along with it. And I would say that a goal should be to identify and utilize best practices from other countries. The U.S. is extremely insular. Actually, other countries and regions, I think, are doing a better job in the U.S. in achieving greenhouse gas mitigation goals. In particular, the EU has developed institutions. Now, achieving these goals is challenging because of the nature of what an efficient system will look like. It's going to be dominated, at least over the next 25 or 30 years, by wind, solar, and storage. Maybe some new nuclear capacity, certainly some existing nuclear capacity. But it's going to basically be a wind, solar, and storage system supported by some residual dispatchable generation and increased storage. And the challenge here is that wind and solar generation are intermittent. The output's driven by variations in the wind and solar irradiation, and the variation can be very, very significant. And this is really quite different from the traditional electric power systems that grew up during the 20th century and that we've relied on so far in the 21st century, which is basically a system primarily of thermal generation that can be dispatched according to various economic dispatch routines, whether they're market-based or not. The stochastic properties of these systems are very different from the systems we have now, and this raises a variety of valuation issues from the perspective of reliability. I think the more challenging aspects is to recognize that the best locations for wind and solar generation are quite different from the locations of existing generation and the supporting transmission infrastructure. The new facilities are going to be ideally constructed in places that are quite different from existing facilities, and exploiting these resources efficiently is going to require expansions in the transmission infrastructure, both inside systems and connecting systems, or even building new systems in areas where there is no generation, especially here in the Northeast, where offshore wind has become a major target of opportunity for developing zero-carbon resources. And as already indicated, this all has to take place in a system in which demand is going to grow for electricity. We've spent the last 20 years, electricity demand's been stagnant or falling in the United States. But if we really are serious about using clean electricity to expand electric vehicles, light-duty vehicles, and mid-sized vehicles, convert buildings from gas and oil to electricity, and electrify other sectors, we're going to have to achieve dramatic changes on the supply side while also accommodating increases in demand of a significant nature, which means that there'll be more facilities that need to be built to support that new demand.
Thanks. Great. Bill, I'd like to turn to the situation we're in today.
how would you characterize where we're at today in the development of electricity capacity, especially capacity that can support wind, solar, hydro, and other low-carbon electricity production? And we'll turn to others to talk about some of the obstacles, but what does the system look like? And where are we if we're to take the gradient where we are today in terms of the development?
Well, it's I think the short version of the story about the grid, and in particular in this infrastructure, is that we have a very sophisticated and large interconnected transmission system, and that's both good news and bad news because it creates all kinds of complications, partly because of the interactions. We have regional markets that New England, New York, the Mid-Atlantic, and so on, or across the country, that are attentive to their regions, but they don't do a very good job of the interregional problem and addressing the kinds of issues that Paul was just talking about. And the physics of the infrastructure and trying to, there are actually three main ones here in the continental states, the eastern, the western, and the Texas system that are very mildly, but they're not synchronized, which so it's more difficult to transport or exchange between them. There's a whole layer of institutional issues that are we're confronting and trying to deal with that kind of regional grid. So the good news is that we have a pretty good start in the physics. The bad news is that a lot of these institutional problems have been in the way and will continue to be in the way. I would mention four things that I think we probably want to talk more about. The first one is, I won't elaborate on because you'll get the idea, which is, well, winners and losers, right? So there's going to be winners and losers in this process, and that's not unusual. We have that all over the place in various policy questions. But it produces the normal kinds of complications, but these interact with other processes. The second and major thing that you would expect me to be talking about is the permitting process for making decisions about which lines are going to be built and getting those approved. And it's a hodgepodge that has developed over the years. I participated recently with the Harvard Electricity Policy Group in a sort of in-depth discussion of this. That conversation was all off the record, so I can't tell you who said it, but the best line of the whole day was describing this system as a spider web of entities that have the power to say no. and so the description that you will get, conventional description of the permitting process, is a 10-year process to get to know. All of these processes. That's unsustainable if we want to meet this objective, and how to deal with that is critical. There's another related issue, which doesn't come up in this conversation until you get into, at least in my experience, with the parties who are directly involved, but it's very important, and that is it's about the money. So part of the story here is who's going to pay for all of these things and the cost allocation process. And the foundations, I'm probably an outlier in this matter, but the foundations of this process, I would say, is largely broken. So if you think about the core regulation that was adopted more than a decade ago, starts out with a premise that we could have different policies with transmission lines that are needed for economics because they lower costs, or we could have a different process for transmission lines that are needed for reliability because they help us keep the lights on. Or we can have a different process for transmission lines which are needed for what's called public policy, which means renewables. That's what that translates into. And then you say, well, I thought there were transmission lines. Transmission lines affect the economics, they affect reliability, and they affect public policy. So the notion that you can divide it into these three categories and have completely different criteria and decision processes just makes no sense. And it creates all kinds of problems that are related to cost allocation. And when I talk to people who are working in the trenches, they think the cost allocation problem is at least as big a problem as all of the other permitting problems along the way. And then finally, this is sort of insider baseball, I guess. It's not the kind of thing that most people pay attention to, but we have a separate related institution called the capacity market for generation in the electricity system. And I could go into some of the details of that, but one of the characteristics of the capacity market is that it requires certification that the generation is deliverable to the load when you acquire this generation. That's a very hard problem to solve. I would say it's actually a problem we don't know how to solve, but nonetheless, it's an institutional requirement. And we see the effects of this every day because we have very long queues of people trying to develop renewable projects who can't get connected to the grid. And then they say, why do I have to wait so long to get permission to get connected to the grid? The answer is capacity markets, because not only do they want to get connected to the grid, but they want to be certified to be part of the capacity market, which is a completely arcane process that has very little in the way, I'd say, of coherent intellectual foundations. That creates an enormous number of problems. If you actually want to just connect to the grid and start providing energy along the way without getting guarantees of these other payments for capacity, that queue is very short and it's not very hard. And you can do it just as the way you would think. It's kind of an extension cord problem. So most of the debate that's actually going on here in all of this permitting and cost allocation and that is interconnected with this other capacity market. And one of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioners released a paper yesterday about many things which I would disagree, but one thing I certainly agree is he said the capacity market is fundamentally broken, and that's something else that we've got to fix along the way.
Great. Chris, shifting to the future, what are the potential accelerants to the development of low carbon energy infrastructure? So these include things like public investments, regulations, technological innovations. Where would you take it? Where do you think we're heading on things that are going to accelerate development?
Well, we certainly have two recent bills that are going to, or laws now, that are going to accelerate. So the Inflation Reduction Act is handing out a lot of carrots to the generation side of this. So that's going to increase the incentive to build more solar and more wind and so on. And Paul touched on this, but the fundamental problem we have, why we need more transmission, is that the best places for the renewables are not where people are living, right? So the best places for onshore wind is the Midwest. The best places for solar is the Southwest. The best places for, at least now, for offshore wind is the Northeast. So we have to connect those cheap resources to the population centers. And as you give more money to the generation side, the value of making those connections increase and the value of building those generation resources increase. So that creates more transmission problems. So it's kind of is that an accelerant to building the transmission? Well, probably, because there's going to be more incentive. There's going to be more need for transmission because of handing out all these carrots under the IRA. And then we also have the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which actually has explicit money for building infrastructure. So that's an accelerant as well. One that's kind of, since you said we're looking into the future, Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator Whitehouse has, I think it's only 31 pages. It's a bill that is the goal of which is to solve the transmission siting problem. In fact, the bill's name is SITE. I forget what it stands for, but that's clever. And what that would do is create a federal authority to actually be the one to decide where transmission lines are going to be built. And I did a check today. Eminent domain is mentioned 17 times in that 31 pages. So in many ways, I think it would be a central authority to apply eminent domain when needed, instead of this hodgepodge of trying to build these transmission lines. I think the poster child of how hard this is we've been trying to connect the cheap hydro in Quebec to Massachusetts for quite some time here. And to steal a line from Paul, the problem with transmission is that it's long and skinny, right? And so what that means is it goes through lots and lots of landowners, and each of which basically have veto power. So, how do you solve that without some federal authority with the threat, at least, of imminent domain? It's hard to understand how you might do that. So, in some sense, we should be happy we have this problem. The reason why we have this problem is solar and wind are cheap, and we want to put it in the places where solar and wind are cheapest. If solar and wind were super expensive, we wouldn't have a transmission problem. In order to decarbonize, we'd have to build a bunch of nuclear plants everywhere. So, and we could basically put those where we want. So, kind of our well, we can't build them at all, but in this theory of having to build them. So, in some ways, we're kind of a victim of the success of the cheap solar and wind.
Great. All right. Tell us about the breaks to the system. So we've heard about some of them already, but permitting, market institutions, technology, especially storage capacity, seem like the big obstacles. How do we address those challenges? Where would you take us?
Well, I was going to identify another obstacle.
Okay.
So I think I agree that we need more transmission. So let me take a step back and say there's basically two kinds of transmission transmission is financed sort of in two different ways. There's a sort of privately financed way called merchant transmission, where you basically have a developer comes in and has a business plan. And today these business plans look like we're going to have a bunch of wind farms that somebody else is going to own in, let's say, Kansas, where wind is really cheap. And we're going to come in and we're going to build a giant transmission line that, let's say, is going to take all that energy to Chicago. That's one model. And there's a couple of reasons to be optimistic that this model is going to get some steam, but this is a tiny fraction of how transmission is built. The dominant model is the traditional utility model, where your local or regional monopoly utility finances it through traditional utility rates, where the regulator sets the profit margin and the utility recovers at pretty much every dollar it spends, even if it's not particularly efficient at doing that. That's how almost all transmission is actually built. So when we talk about permitting reform and sort of getting these approvals faster, I think that's really going to help this first kind of transmission. These developers that are trying to go hundreds of miles across multiple states, it's privately funded, and for them, shaving a few years off of this permitting timeline can really be significant for their business model. They want to go fast. They want to deploy this stuff. And there's wind and solar developers that are ready to go on one end of that line to make this all happen. But most of the transmission is built through utilities, and they kind of have the opposite incentive. They are not in a rush. The traditional utility business model is backwards looking. It's worried about how they're going to recover the costs of investments they made 20, 30 years ago, and their sort of local areas of control, their local monopolies, can be threatened by building these large-scale lines that can bring in energy from other places and potentially undercut some of their historic investments. So they're often sort of defensively positioning themselves and trying to make sure that they're in control of how this system unfolds over the long term. So I think a key institutional challenge is trying to figure out how to deal with the utilities' incentives. I think one way to potentially get at that sort of from the outside is to really put some reforms in place that will encourage these alternative development models, these merchant development models. And maybe if we can get more of those projects off the ground, it'll kind of give the utility industry a kick in the pants that it needs, that it has to kind of start doing things a little differently.
Great. I'm going to open things up for conversation, questions, and I'll just float around. So I'll probably start on this side of the room and sweep across. Tell us who you are and then your question. And if it's a question for somebody in specific, direct it, or for the whole panel.
Sure. Bill DeCrose with Vicinity Energy. We heat and cool cities, urban cores mainly. But we're in the process of electrifying. But a major barrier that in many of these forums I've been in that no one wants to talk about is after you've built this great electron superhighway called the transmission system, it's got no off-ramps. The distribution system is really the stinky part of the problem that people don't want to talk about. I mean, if you look at, you still need substations and wires to connect the buildings in particularly urban cores where you're trying to retire the gas grid. Right? That's what we're trying to do. Retire the gas grid, electrify, and grow. And I mean, just an example, local example for any folks around here, the substation that's going into Cambridge. First substation to go into Boston, Cambridge area in probably 20 plus years, and it's $1 billion. And how many of those substations do we need to electrify Boston? So my only point in bringing that up is if we don't wrap that into the conversation, because I know particularly Paul sitting on Exelon's board, you know, and I've talked to the CEOs of Exelon and you know, PSE&G and Eversource up and down the coast. And it's just something that doesn't come into the conversation. I'm wondering why.
Can I respond to that? I think there's growing recognition that the distribution system, however exactly you define it, but the distribution system in the U.S. is old, antiquated, and largely ignored, in part because electricity demand was stagnant for a long time. Most utilities I know that have T&D systems are looking at the growth in electric vehicle charging and in the use of heat pumps and other electric applications, and recognize they're going to have to not only expand their distribution systems, but they're going to have to change their configurations to deal with different kinds of power flows. And I think that recognition is growing. I also think that they're also recognizing they can put all this stuff into the rate base, and if they have an attractive regulatory framework, they can actually get their money back and earn a good return on it. And I think you're going to be seeing more and more of that. One of the things that I fear is that we're going to start to see the same issues on the distribution system as we're seeing in the placement of wind and solar facilities and transmission lines, where people aren't going to want a big new substation in their neighborhood. And I think the most successful substations I've seen, and there are quite a, is that you don't even know they're a substation. They put them in a building or they put them underground because the neighborhoods don't want them. So I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that.
Could I just? Sure.
I think maybe to try to create some conflict on the panel, I actually think it's a positive if this stuff is being done by utilities, because utilities want to build a lot of capital, right? They want it in the rate base. I think one problem with transmission is it often spans multiple utilities. So then now you have a coordination problem. But on the distribution side, CEPR has a lot of utility sponsors, and we go to those utilities and they want to build all this stuff, right? They want to put in smart meters, substations, anything that goes into the rate base. So you do. So but at least we've solved that problem, as opposed to a transmission line that has to go through a bunch of landowners where they're all saying, I don't want this thing. So, you know, the glass is half full, is that the inefficient regulatory structure that is rate of return regulation is probably helping us on at least on that front.
Could I make one other comment on this? Given that I've been on the boards of five utilities in my life, the smartest people in the old days went into generation, and they built nuclear power plants. Then the next smartest people, they designed transmission systems and ways of moving the power around. And the people at the bottom of the intellectual were in the distribution sector. And that's changing, in part because of the needs for it, but also remember, a lot of these utilities have had to spin off their generation. They're not in the generation business anymore. And I think the opportunities to bring modern technology to these old systems and to expand them is starting to attract some smart people developing better models for how you do this in an efficient way. And so in that sense, combined with the positive incentives of rate of return regulation, I think makes me more optimistic about making progress in that area.
Can I make one more just quick comment that we're seeing? So, for example, in this area, life science has been a huge growth driver for Boston, Cambridge, right? And when you see these disparate approaches, city to city or region to region, So let's just say you're successful in Boston and you build 5 substations to electrify because the labs are big users. And we've seen 7 million square feet for 10 years added. If you make it so expensive in Boston, they move because there's no overarching, at least on the transmission front, there's FERC involved. When you get down into distribution, it's the Wild West in every city you go to. So just another food for thought on maybe it's easy, but because the lab won't.
Easier.
Say again?
Easy.
Okay. We can debate this one. I don't know how.
I'm going to come down here and then go back up top, just for smooth.
Great. So first of all, I feel like this is a great panel to kind of square a lot of the things we heard this morning. So everybody's looking to the grid for many of these transition pathways. And I feel like I heard more about bottlenecks than what is going to give us that 50% extra capacity needed for electrification. So maybe I could ask each of you if there was a breakthrough in the next 10 years, other than on the permitting side, where would you see that? Do you see business model innovation? Do you see coal to geothermal? Do you see, maybe the argument that Kerry made that Biden should turn this into a military crisis? Like what do you think is going to get us so that we have a grid that can make electrification work?
All right. Ari, you want to take that first?
I think we'll do it. But I'm not sure that there's going to be a single unifying policy. I think one thing that's, I don't know if it's unique, but one important characteristic of our grid is that it is local and regional in nature. We don't have sort of a national model like a lot of other countries have. It's a fragmented system. So we'll have sort of different experiments happening across the country, being led by different state regulators or utilities at the local level. And so we'll kind of muddle through. And I think ultimately, the needs will push through solutions.
Bill, thoughts on this?
Well, one thing I've learned in my career is that I don't know the answer to this question. And so I've been surprised over the years. Just think about fracking and what happened with natural gas as opposed to running out. So I think we have to maintain an open mind about what it is going to be. And I'm most interested in getting the incentives right so that all the smart people in this room who are trying to develop these technologies can go at each other's throats and end up doing the right thing in the aggregate. And I think that's the biggest challenge here. And I don't see any way to avoid that. And we're not doing a good job of that, I would say, in trying to getting these incentives right. As a matter of fact, in some sense, our policies, as I summarized before, are kind of going in the wrong direction. And there's other problems that these interact with each other. So we looked a few years ago, I was involved in an effort to look at grid scale storage that was really cheap. And then where should you put it? And we went and we did something which then was relatively new, but we went to look a lot of actual data on what prices were and arbitrage and buying low and selling high, all that kind of stuff. And we discovered a number of things, which is that if you want to have successful battery innovation, you got to make it really cheap because it's going to have a very hard time competing. The second thing that we learned, which I think is also extremely important, is that if you want to have a large-scale battery, grid-scale battery, you better put it on a truck, because the places that it's really valuable this year are not the places where it's going to be valuable next year. And that's because of the interaction with the transmission grid, which is going on. And so you can get your whole economics wiped. They don't last that long. So you have to deal with this portability problem and moving those things around. So, and I think that's just inherent in the nature of that technology. I've been very impressed with all the things that we've done with renewables and getting the costs down and so on. The progress in batteries is amazing, but not there yet. But I think more than trying to guess the technology that is going to be important and then torque the rules so that you can get that technology, I think you should be starting with the incentives and get the structure of those incentives right and let the people who are competing figure out lots of different ways. And my expectation is that 10 years from now, we'll be talking about some technology that I forgot to mention just now. So.
Anybody else on this? Taking it up top.
Thank you so much. I'm Ramon Sanchez. I work at the Harvard School of Public Health. And my question is, how come, I hear you talking about different aspects, of where to site operations for energy. And how come part of the answer is not having renewable energy or operations for energy where you need it the most? And let me elaborate on that. In some places in the Midwest, coal is about 40 to 67% of the energy generation in the community. You have a lot of transmission lines. You can transport that everywhere in the at least on that region of the country. However, none of you mentioned public health as one of the reasons, or even climate as one of the reasons on where to site the operations for renewable energies. And I was wondering why.
I'll give this to Chris.
Well, I would say that that's certainly implicit with everything we were talking about. Why are we doing this? For climate change reasons. You brought up local pollution issues, and those exist as well. The fundamental problem, though, is where those coal plants are not great places to build solar farms. So you have to build the solar farms somewhere else.
Yeah, but they are great for wind farms.
Not usually, no. You don't have the land for one, right? A given coal plant doesn't have the land available to it. But what I think fundamentally what you're saying is that when we think about where we should site things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we should also bring in the fact that we could if there's one location that also brings down NOx and local pollution, we should take that into account. And certainly the modeling efforts that I'm sure Harvard does and MIT does typically takes that into account, the co-benefits from investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Say a couple of quick things. One, so that point of interconnection for that coal plant may be sort of the property of that coal plant, and it may not be willing to just sort of give it to a wind farm. The other thing is that, again, we have a fragmented system, both at the ownership level and also at the policy level, right? So we don't really have in this country a national renewable energy goal or a national carbon goal. It's done through things like the IRA. And so you have different outcomes in different states. So to give you an example, about the 40% of our coal in this country comes from Wyoming. The major utility company in Wyoming also serves Oregon, California, and Washington, which have very different policy goals than Oregon. So when that utility that was serving all of these states decided it wanted to invest heavily in renewables, Wyoming told it to basically slow down because it wanted to keep those coal plants open.
I think that's a really good point. I think we need to recognize that the U.S., we don't have a climate change policy. We don't have a cap on emissions. We have hopes and prayers, I guess, that we'll get somewhere by 2035 or 2050. And the result of that is that this has devolved to the states. So we have 20 plus states that have established their own climate policies. They're going to be net zero, whatever exactly that means, by 2040 or 2045 or 2050. They have their own policies. So Rhode Island had, for example, where Sheldon Whitehouse was the Attorney General, Rhode Island has its own climate policy. They're building their own transmission lines to connect their own offshore wind farms that they're taking competitive bids for and assigning someone to be the counterparty on them. And I think this is very problematic. To me, it's a step backward for this all to be devolved to the states. We spent 100 years expanding the regional expanse of electric power sectors. There have been an enormous number of mergers to create larger service areas. We've reduced the number of control area operators. But in the last several years, because of the absence of a clear national policy, we have every state kind of doing their own thing. And that seems to me to really be problematic. And in the end, it's not going to all add up to what they think it's going to add up to because it's completely uncoordinated.
Oh, Bill, sorry.
So I think the point about other pollutants is right on, and I think and that's a problem of the effects and the impacts are all different. I'm a carbon tax guy, a sulfur tax guy, and charge them for what they emit. And these alternative policies, which are trying to come through various subsidies and so forth to do it indirectly. In the Central Atlantic States, PJM, the Mid-Atlantic States, the market monitor has been for years publishing this table in which he says, well, let's look at all the different state policies, and then let's look at the implied carbon price that comes out of those state policies across these different kinds of technologies. Now, the one thing we know about this, I think all the at the panel would agree, is in theory, the right carbon price is the same everywhere. And what we have, in fact, is implied carbon prices, which differ by a factor of 10 across the states. So it's completely inefficient.
Great. I had a couple questions in the middle. Nat.
Thanks, Nat. Yep, Nat Cohen from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. I guess I have two questions, one big, one small. The big one is, so Congress is considering permitting reform. What's the policy they should consider at a federal level that would make a difference? I want to stipulate that we all agree that a carbon price would be good, so I want to focus on transmission or permitting policy, permitting reform policy in some ways. So I'm interested in sort of what would you say? We've heard a little bit of got to get the incentives right. We heard about the merchants, but I'm interested in what would your policy recommendation be to Congress? And then the second, which is a smaller one, just following up on this, of course, coal plants aren't built where the wind blows or the sun shines, but I know there's increasing interest in putting small modular nuclear reactors in coal plants. What do you think about that? Interested in whether that's a viable solution? Thanks.
Paul, do you want to talk about SMRs?
Yeah, I may have a kind of a non-standard view on permitting reform. I don't think the big problem on the electric power side is federal permitting laws. I mean, if you can make them faster and more efficient, I think that's fine. But if you just pick projects like the two projects, recent projects to build transmission lines from Hydro-Quebec into southern New England, the first one in New Hampshire, it was killed by local environmental group and state laws. Similarly, the replacement project through Maine has been up and down through the state courts. Both those projects had federal permits to import electricity to meet the NEPA requirements. So I think some of these proposals are fine, but I don't think they're gonna fix the problem. The problems are really with the states and municipalities that have numerous ways of saying no to the lines. And Sheldon Whitehouse's approach of federalizing this may be a potential solution, although I think when he was Attorney General of Rhode Island, he would have opposed almost everything in that bill. So I think a better way of thinking about this is to recognize that there are gainers and losers, and some of the losers can say no. And the best way to try to deal with them is to compensate them for the burdens that they're facing. And I'll give you an example. I know it's a shock, but we actually did build a large DC transmission line from James Bay in Quebec to right off of Route 128 in Massachusetts in the late 1980s. It took 5 years. It went through Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and it went through 50 different towns, and they got compensated in one way or another. Vermont was a problem; they got a little more than their share of the cheap electricity. If you go up and down the line and you go back to the date like 1989 or 1990, every one of those towns has a new fire station or a new police station or some other thing that they were able to finance from property taxes or from contributions. So I think we have to start thinking more about carrots and less about sticks in dealing with this, and also recognize that there are environmental groups, there are offshore. There are going to be fishermen. There are going to be people who are concerned about. You have to deal with them up front and try to come to an understanding that minimizes the damage and compensates people for the residual damage in a way that they stand aside.
Small modular reactors?
Oh,
So I was tempted to bring up small modular reactors to the earlier question, but Bill's exactly right. Let's get the incentives right and let the innovators actually decide what technology wins. But small modular reactors would be great, right? We can replace all the coal plants and even gas plants with that. Another interesting technology, I think the company's called Malta, where you take a coal plant, you get rid of the boiler, and you put molten salts in. And then what you do is when electricity is cheap, you melt those salts and store the heat. You leverage the old generator that's already on site from the coal plant, and when electricity is expensive, you run it backwards. So there are innovative ways to try to use the existing infrastructure in ways that would require less additional transmission.
I've worked on nuclear power since the early 1970s, and I can tell you nobody has ever overestimated the cost of a nuclear power plant. In the history of the world, nobody has ever, in any country. And go for it. I mean, these are interesting technologies. If they can bring them in, find sites for them, and bring them in at a cost that's competitive, I think it can be really terrific. But I'm going to remain skeptical until I see it for real.
Ari and Bill.
So I'll agree with Paul that I don't think siting is the biggest challenge here, as I kind of said before. But let me give you 4 policies that are actually on the table in Congress that I like. One, I do like White House's SITE Act. It only applies to large-scale interstate projects. So it's limited in the number of projects they would actually bring up to the federal level. And as I said, I think that would help the merchant projects. 2, I hope will soon be a bill that would require some amount of connection between planning regions in this country. There's like 10 of these different electricity planning regions in the country, and they are not well connected. I think that would be a big boost if they were. So to basically require some minimum level of connection would be another one. The third one is Paul mentioned the local fire stations and things like that. A piece of the Manchin permitting bill basically says for those sorts of local economic development sort of goodies, you can include those in rates. So it helped kind of give out some of these local goodies if you could put those in the rates. And the IRA has $760 million for these sorts of local benefits, and so that hopefully we'll see how this is actually used and maybe learn something from how this $760 million is spent. The last one, which is also in the Manchin permitting bill, I think the utility industry is going to lie down in front of this one on the tracks, but is to basically give FERC authority to cost allocate projects that are declared in the national interest. So if you're a developer, you have a really good idea for a project, you go to DOE, get it certified, and then FERC then has authority to figure out who's actually going to pay for that project. I think that would really shake things up.
Bill, you got a comment?
I think without embracing 100% of everything, these are all very good ideas, and I'm very sympathetic to. But Nat, I have to say, in my heart, the worst thing that troubles me most about this is I don't see any way out of this problem without eminent domain authority at the federal level. And what does eminent domain authority means? That means that somebody's going to say, I'm going to compensate you this much and no more. Shut up. Okay, and that's going to leave a whole lot of people real unhappy. And I wish there was a way to get around that, and we didn't have to do that. But frankly, I just don't see how we can.
Great. Question up in the back.
Clarence Schwab, you answered a number of interesting points that I was about to ask, but one still remains, which is, will Sheldon Whitehouse be able to pass this site bill? Will it pass? What does FERC need to get its authority to do what you just suggested, to cost allocate of national interest? Isn't that's part of the Manchin bill? That's passed? What does it need to pass? What's the likelihood, in your view, that these will pass? And if not these, something like them that you agree with.
Go ahead, Ari.
I would just say one thing I try to avoid in my job is predicting what Congress is going to do. So I don't know what it's going to take. The White House bill was introduced in the previous Congress, and it didn't get a vote or anything. It's attached right now to a Democrat House bill on various permitting reform and other energy, clean energy issues. I think that's just sort of a messaging bill. So I don't have the answer for how to sort of get this through the political process, other than to say it's hard to get agreement on major change in this area. In 2005, Congress did give FERC what's called backstop permitting authority, and then it reformed that in the Infrastructure Act in 2021, where basically FERC has authority where a state rejects a line. There's certain qualifications around this, but where a state rejects it, FERC can basically overdo that, overwrite that rejection and approve the project. It has yet to be actually used, but that is something that Congress actually did put in place. That's the biggest reform Congress has ever done in this area.
So Stephen left the mic in my hands, but the one thing that makes me optimistic is I think there's room for horse trading here, right? So Manchin's bill is about building more fossil fuel infrastructure. White House's bill is about building transmission lines for decarbonization. I feel like there's a trade there that can take place where you get both of them.
I think people are putting too much faith in FERC. I actually think it's a weak regulatory agency. The commission itself has been divided now for at least 10 years and maybe 20 years. When they faced hard decisions, they backed off. Order 1000, which seemed to be an expansion of competition focused on interregional transmission, has been a failure, and they backed off from it. So I'm not sure that we're going to see a whole lot of bravery coming out of FERC unless there are some reforms to FERC as well, or some clear legislation that says if it's a national interest project and it's been certified, they have to do X, Y, and Z, and they don't have to take the political heat because that's what the law says. But I think we have to look at FERC as well, because there are assumptions about their effectiveness and their courage in tackling controversial issues, which I think may be inconsistent with reality.
Apparently, I'm doing this now. Probably nobody remembers who Phil Donahue is, but at least I do. I'll go up. Or we could turn into Jerry Springer, if you like.
Two questions. Why has the United States been slow to adopt vehicle-to-grid charging for electric cars the way that they have in Japan and Europe? And wouldn't a network of electric chargers be a very low-cost way to add capacity to the grid, especially for the flutter that comes from renewable energy? The second is, what are we going to do about these people who want to take substations as target practice, and just how vulnerable is the grid to being taken out by sabotage?
You're the expert.
Yeah, I don't think a bunch of charging stations solves the transmission problem. It might exacerbate it, actually. But vehicle to grid, I think at some point there'll be enough vehicles where the benefits of that will be large. I think without injecting power from vehicles, you can get a lot of the benefits by just throttling how quickly you're charging as well. One issue with vehicle to grid is you're using the battery a lot, right? So although the Ford advertises the benefits of a F-150 Lightning is you can inject power, and I don't think they really want you to do that, right? Because they have to warranty the battery. So I think there's some interesting kind of incentive issues that will need to be solved for that.
I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. I think there's a lot of innovation that can happen at the local level, whether it's vehicle to grid or other sorts of new applications. But I'm concerned that if these things roll out at the speed of the utilities and not at the speed of innovation and what the market wants, then I think we're all going to lose out.
There's another troubling fact that we should deal with here is that when we were reforming the wholesale electricity market a few decades ago, based on the work of people like Paul and his colleagues at MIT, one of the advantages that we had was that we already had power pools that were doing active management of the system. They had developed just over the years. They had the engineering, they had all the infrastructure for doing that. And what was required was, by comparison, a relatively modest change with the economics and how the was priced and the settlements process. That was extremely difficult to do, but we started from the position of this legacy of what was called economic dispatch. We don't have that infrastructure down on the distribution system. And the scale of the distribution system is much larger than the scale of, there are papers from the early 80s explaining how to do this in theory. We know how to do it. That's not the problem. The problem is just getting all of those institutions that haven't been doing this to now start doing something that is the equivalent of this economic dispatch story in a rapidly moving and complicated environment. And I think, frankly, at the moment, we don't know how to do that in reality. I mean, we know how to do it, and I can write papers and show it to my friends, but when you get right down to the nitty-gritty of changing these institutions and all of these people that Paul was talking about, that's a big challenge that's before us, and we should be thinking about that at the same time.
So I think we have time for two more, and since we haven't done this side, I think I'll do you and then.
Yeah, so thanks for all excellent conversation. My name's Trisha Schramm, former HKS PhD. I'm curious about, there's, clearly identified that public opposition to siting is a huge barrier. But I've noticed a couple of times today, there's been a discussion or a question on the table of how do we overcome that opposition? How do we deal with that opposition? And there's not even a framework of answers. I haven't, I think you guys provided some good information with incentives and compensating, but I'm curious, is there the spending, is there the financing for engagement and strategic communications with the public to help deal with some of these siting issues, and in part to counter some of the opposition to these sorts of issues? You mentioned the environmental groups, or somebody mentioned environmental groups tanking some of the permitting processes, and there's also some information. There's some of that stuff is actually more AstroTurf, where it's funded by other folks who are injecting money into this conversation. So is that being countered with a strategic communication that's well funded for those who are wanting to increase renewables?
I mean, I would only say that I think the developers recognize this problem and understand the importance of early engagement, but I don't know that they, it's always harder to make a positive than a negative case. So I don't know that they've sort of cracked the code on how to do this, other than to understand that this is something they need to do better on.
There is an academic discipline that's not represented here, that people who do negotiation and activities, and I think there's a lot to learn from that. I had a master's student a couple of years ago who wrote a thesis comparing 4 different large infrastructure projects, 2 of which succeeded and 2 of which failed. And the differences had to do with the negotiation framework, how early you engaged all of the parties, how you engaged the parties, how you took them seriously, whether you could adapt the project to their concerns. And I really think there's something to learn there, and that it can be formalized, and resources could be provided from the IRA 2 or whatever the next law is to try to support these activities. That's not the only thing, but I think a better job can be done, and I think developers do recognize this now, and projects do get done. I mean, there's a new merchant line coming down from Quebec to New York City that has an anchor tenant. It's Hydro-Quebec. It's being financed by a Blackstone, a private equity firm, and they managed to get permits through all of the towns and an interconnection point in Queens, near where I grew up. And it can be done, but I think we need to compare projects that succeed and those that fail. And people who do negotiations really do that kind of thing, and I think it'd make a positive contribution.
The one thing I'll add while I walk up here is MIT had about a month ago or 2 months ago an offshore wind conference where the developers, offshore wind developers, kept talking about how better Europe is in this front, in the sense that before they do the auction for the offshore wind sites, they negotiate with all the stakeholders, so it's ready to go, right? Whereas here, you win the auction and then you go negotiate with the fishermen and fishing industry and the point of generation or transmission interconnection. So there does seem to be best practices that aren't always used in the U.S.
Thanks. Thanks so much for a great discussion. My name's Sarah Carrico, and so I formalized my negotiation training at Harvard Law School, and I would love to read that case study or your students' report. My question is, as you're thinking about reform, how are you studying and measuring vibrational and other impacts on biodiversity in the web of life, and considering those stakeholders that none of us can live without, like pollinators, plankton, in making decisions on how to incentivize and work towards a better energy infrastructure for us all?
Who wants that one?
It's a good illustration of the diversity of interests that we have to consider here, but I'm not aware of who's actively working on that.
I think that's certainly part of the permitting process and part of the application process is to look at the environmental impacts of these decisions. So I guess implicitly we've all been assuming that part of the process is not what's broken. It's other parts, but you bring up certainly a good point. So we're out of time. We've lost our moderator, but maybe I'll just go down the line and allow people to 10 seconds of final comments.
Thanks everyone for your interest.
Thanks everyone for excellent questions.
Here he is. Oh, you're good.
Thanks for the opportunity, and I hope we can get the incentives to be a lot better than they are.
Yeah, my final point is we need to figure this out, right? So if we have any hope of meeting any goal, this is going to have to be solved. So that's always when it's a necessary condition that often that helps things out.
Thank you, everybody.